Hi, adolescent development students. Before we get into the topic for today, I wanted to show you this cartoon that I stumbled across kind of at the beginning of our remote distance learning, and it was just so, it just seems so appropriate. So here's teaching in 2020. When the semester begins, wonderful, everything, these great plans, and then we're told to plan for possible remote teaching, and things start to change a little bit and get a little sketchier. And then when we're making the teaching and then actual teaching, we're doing good to just sketch out a line drawing. So sometimes it feels like that. We're all doing the best we can, but yeah, this is quite an exercise. Okay, so we're going to turn to the topic of moral and spiritual development. Obviously, one of the big major themes within this chapter, within this course, I should say, and that is how do adolescents learn right from wrong? How do they learn to make good decisions or not so great decisions? And I thought I would start off with just a couple of typical, not unusual moral dilemmas for teenagers and just kind of read them to you real quick. So the first one has to do with tests. You have a major test today that you haven't studied for, and you need a good grade to boost your average up in the class. A friend of yours already took the test and offers you the answers on a cheat sheet. Would you take the answers or not? Why? Explain what your answer would be. So think about how teenagers would respond to this. Some of them would say, yes, I'd take the answers because I did my best, but I just don't get the material. Um, Others might say that it's not right to cheat off of somebody who already took the test. There's a range of answers you could have. So what we're interested in looking at here is not whether teenagers would take the answers or not, but their reasoning behind it. Here's another example. Your parents went away for the weekend and they left their keys to their brand new car. Now, I don't know why a parent would do that, but okay. You have just recently gotten your license and are currently saving for your own car. Your parents forbid you to take the car, but your friends want you to take it for a spin around the block. Would you take the car or not, and explain? So what's your answer? How would teenagers answer this one? Yeah, my parents are never going to find out. It'd be really fun. And my friends would, I'd get in, my friends would think highly of me. Or kids could say, no, my parents trust me and I don't want to violate that trust. So again, we're not necessarily looking at the particular answer they would give, but what their reasoning behind that answer would be. So this chapter is all about how do teenagers reason through problems and make moral decisions. What do adolescents value? Do they value justice? Do they value friendship? Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look at what moral development in adolescence is all about, and we'll start just by definitions here. So moral development involves how people think about and decide on the rules about how we should interact with other people. Okay, so that's kind of big and vague. Here we can get a little bit more specific. We want to learn how do adolescents think about the rules for good behavior. So for example, do teenagers think that cheating is wrong, or do they think that maybe it's okay in certain circumstances? How do they behave in situations? So this looks at, do their attitudes predict their behavior? So teenagers might believe that cheating is wrong, but if they're in a push comes to shove situation, maybe they would cheat. And then how do they feel about moral matters? If they do make a decision that's not right, do they feel bad about it? Or do they feel okay about it? Do they feel good about themselves when they make the right decisions? So some of the research that we're going to talk about here have been done on adults and then kind of generalized to adolescents. So something to think about is that the types of moral decisions that affect teenagers are not the same as affect adults. So teenagers face moral decisions regarding to their parents, truth-telling to their parents, friends and betrayal, school kinds of issues. So that's really just something to keep in mind as we progress through this chapter. So we're going to start here when we look at this. How do they think? How do they behave? How do they feel? We'll start with the thought part, moral thought. How do teenagers think about moral kinds of situations? And we're going to turn back actually to Piaget's theory. This may surprise you some because Piaget is associated with cognitive development, but he also believed that cognitive development had an influence on moral development. But his theory of moral development is just much more simpler than his theory of cognitive development. So Piaget said there are two kinds of morality in childhood, and we start off as young children, 4 to 7 years. So this is in the pre-operational stage of cognitive development. And during this stage, kids have an exaggerated respect for the sanctity of rules. Rules are rules, and if you break the rules, you're in trouble, and nobody's allowed to change the rules except for adults. That's kind of the attitude. So exaggerated respect for rules. And then the really interesting thing about this phase, I guess you could say it, is that the rightness or the wrongness of an act is determined by the person's consequences, by the consequences of the act, not the person's intentions. So let me explain that. Let me give you an example of how the consequences are more important than the intentions. So let's say this little girl right here is helping her mom make a cake or something, and her mom tells her to get something out of a drawer, and she accidentally knocks off 3 glasses from the table when she did that. And then we've got another little girl who was told that she can't have anything to eat before dinner, but she climbs up on the counter to get a cookie and breaks a glass. So the question to kids at this age is, who was naughtier? And the kids most likely would say this little girl, the one who was trying to help her mom, because she broke 3 glasses and the other little girl only broke 1 glass. So what they're looking at is the consequences of the action, 3 glasses versus 1 glass, not the intentions. This little girl was helping her mom and the other little girl was misbehaving. Now that changes as kids start to get older, and around age 10 or so, Piaget says that kids enter into this phase of autonomous morality. And this, when they enter into this, they start to understand that rules and laws can be changed if needed. And when you judge a person's action, it's more important to look at their intentions rather than the consequences. So kids of this age would say, no, the little girl who was getting a cookie before dinner when she wasn't supposed to, she was naughty, or she did the worst thing because she was misbehaving. Even though she only broke 1 glass and the other girl broke 3, they're able to look at the intentions. So with the idea that rules can be changed, these kids are playing checkers. And so let's say that the rules say you're not allowed to double jump. Well, kids at this age understand that if everybody agrees that it's okay, it's okay. So rules can be changed if everybody agrees. Now we also know that heteronymous kids, so let me jump back to the heteronymous morality, believe in something called immanent justice. And this is just how Piaget spelled it. That looks incorrect. But an immanent justice is the idea that kids believe that when they break a rule, they're going to get punished immediately. Punishment will immediately follow. So that's true for heteronymous kids. It doesn't matter whether somebody's around or not. If a little kid misbehaves, they'll immediately look around waiting for the punishment to come. And it's not until kids get to the autonomous level that they know that you're only going to get punished if somebody witnesses what happened or if somebody tells. And even then, punishment isn't always inevitable. You don't always get punished every time you break a rule. So kids start to learn by age 10 or so that rules are a little bit more flexible. They're not necessarily hard and fast, and punishment depends on a lot of things. So based on these ideas, Piaget really thinks that we advance morally due to advances in cognitive development. So they very much run hand in hand in tandem. So kids who are reasoning at formal operations, they can think about abstract concepts like justice, right and wrong, and they can reason through the possibilities of their actions. So as you advance cognitively, you're going to make more sophisticated moral decisions. And he also believes that most moral development comes from interactions with your peers rather than from your parents, because peer interactions call for kids to negotiate and settle things. So as an example, group projects. One of the reasons that kids oftentimes, and college students too, don't like group projects is that many situations one person ends up doing most of the work, and that's not fair. That's not right. But it's up to you to figure that out. I mean, you can always get the teacher involved, but you have to negotiate, you have to talk to the other person. So you're really advancing in terms of your moral thinking based on those interactions. And Piaget says less moral development comes from parent-child interactions because the parents have the power and the rules are often kind of handed down in an authoritarian way. So there really isn't a lot of room for kids to negotiate and make decisions, whether they're good decisions or not, on their own. Okay, just one other comment here before we move on to moral behavior. There's a psychologist named Martin Hoffman, who we will talk about again a little bit later this semester, who developed something called cognitive disequilibrium theory. That sounds like psychobabble. I get that. So what he's talking about here is that adolescence is a really important time for moral development because kids are learning that there's more than one way to view a perspective. I mean, think about when you came to college, you probably learned about different religions, different philosophies, different values and beliefs, and you may not have changed who you are, but it certainly opened your mind to new possibilities. So Hoffman says that adolescence is a time for a lot of change because all those experiences that you have, and that continues into college, allow teens to recognize that there's lots of ways to think about things. There's lots of ways to think about right and wrong. And this comes to things like religion or substance use, war, world peace. So teens may actually start to question their beliefs and then develop their own thinking of moral behavior and moral development separate from who their parents are. So this disequilibrium means an unsettling. So when you reach unsettling, when you reach adolescence, your thoughts get somewhat unsettled because you're learning about new kinds of possibilities, new kinds of value systems. Okay, let's go ahead and move on and talk about how cognitive thought translates or doesn't translate into moral behavior here. So how does moral behavior develop? For adolescents, there are a few things that predict how they learn to behave in appropriate and sometimes in inappropriate manners. And the first theory we'll talk about here is social learning. And you remember from the beginning of the semester that social learning is the role of modeling. So kids observe other people and they make decisions about their behavior based on that. And I know I gave you the example just to recall of an acquaintance I have who didn't want his teenage son smoking, but they saw dad smoking every day and really enjoying it. And they were sneaking cigarettes. The dad just didn't understand it. So that was classic social learning theory. So for adolescents, social learning theory predicts the roles of modeling and then also reinforcement and punishment. So the effectiveness of reinforcement and punishment on teenagers depends, number one, on how consistently they are administered. So teenagers have to have, hold on a second, let me back up. Okay, I'm all right. So the reinforcement has to be done consistently. When I see teenagers in my counseling office and they've got behavior problems, one of the things I hear parents say most often are things like, well, I tried this and it didn't work. I tried taking away the car. I tried taking away their phone. I tried this. And then I'll say to parents, okay, but did you use it consistently? And that's really the issue because parents will try things once and if it doesn't work, they won't do it again. And sometimes you have to try things a number of times before it starts working, before the adolescent understands that you're really serious about it. So it has to be presented consistently. And the effects of that also depends on, I'm backing up here, a little bit on the characteristics of the model. So kids are going to imitate models that they admire, that they see as being warm, not over abusing the power, and whether the models do as they say. Adolescents are very tuned into hypocrisy, as I've mentioned to you, which is why the sons of my acquaintance were smoking no matter what dad said. We also know that moral behavior is very much situationally, let's get up here, very much situationally dependent. A teenager is not likely to display absolutely consistent moral behavior across all settings. So the way to think about it is that there are very few completely honest and very few completely dishonest adolescents. For example, adolescents may be more likely to cheat when their friends are pressuring them or when their chance of being caught is slim. So you take a teenager who generally is very honest, and if you put them in certain kinds of situations, they may be tempted to be dishonest. So those are some things that look at the relationship between moral behavior and moral thought. Now, how about moral feelings, the last of those three? How do adolescents develop feelings of morality? And what we're talking about here is guilt and empathy. Do they feel guilty when they've done something wrong or they're thinking about doing something wrong? And do they feel empathy for other people that perhaps they have hurt or may be suffering? That's really the question. A lot of this is related to child rearing techniques and the development of moral feelings. So let's take a look at this here. We know that there are several child rearing techniques that have an effect on moral development, a very powerful effect on moral development. So while Piaget didn't see the parents as playing the primary role in moral development, other developmental psychologists absolutely do. So there are three techniques in particular we're interested in looking at. With love withdrawal, it's somewhat literal. Parents withdraw attention or love from their child. And most of the time they don't actually start loving them, but they'll say things to them like, I don't like you when you do that. Or if you do that again, I'm going to leave. I remember when my mom was young, or not when I was young, excuse me. My mom was young too. My mom was only 22 when she had me, so she's a young mother. But occasionally over the years when I was young, if I would misbehave, she would say things like, we're going to send you to the orphanage if you keep doing that. And, she didn't mean malintent. She was young. She didn't know any better. She must have been frustrated with our behavior. But to a kid, that's the scariest thing you can absolutely hear. So that's an example of love withdrawal. Power assertion, this is just like it sounds when a parent attempts to gain control over their child. And this would be things like taking away privileges or threatening, of course, spanking the child. And then induction, this third one I want to talk about, and please listen closely because people tend to misunderstand induction quite a bit. Induction is when a parent uses reason to point out the consequences of their behavior on others. They use reason and explanation of the consequences for the child's action on others. So an example would be to say to a child, don't hit Sammy. He was trying to help. Look, you've hurt Sammy's feelings. He's crying because you hit him. Or, why are you yelling at her? She didn't mean to trip you, and now she's upset because you yelled at her. So yes, it's using reason. Yes, it's using talking, but it goes further than that. Here's the key. Pointing out the consequences of the child's or the teen's action on others. So I could say to my teenager, when you told so-and-so your friend's secret, that hurt his feelings deeply. He's going to have a hard time trusting you because you told his secret. So you are basically showing the kid or the teen what they have done to hurt another person. That is going to lead to positive moral development. And let's talk more about that. We know that love withdrawal and power assertion both cause high emotional arousal in kids. And specifically, love withdrawal brings about anxiety. As I've just mentioned, to a kid, the worst thing in the world is losing their parents or losing their parents' love. So that just makes the kid anxious when you say things like, I'm not going to love you if you do that again. And then power assertion brings out hostility. So think about it. How do you all feel when somebody tries to assert power over you? You feel mad about it. You feel hostile. And then induction, on the other hand, provokes moderate arousal. So when you use induction for a kid or a teenager, you don't say it like, oh, look, you hurt Tommy's feelings and now Tommy's crying because you hurt his feelings. You say it in a more forceful, urgent way. Tommy is crying because you hurt him. You really hurt his feelings. Do you see that? So this promotes moderate arousal into the kid. So they're not afraid of losing the parents' love. They're not having power assertion used against them, but it promotes moderate arousal and it promotes moral development because the kid is able to pay attention to the message you're trying to give them. And that message is somebody is hurting because you have done that. You should not do things like that because you hurt other people. And that promotes empathy, which is understanding other people's feelings, and pro-social behavior. So using inductive discipline brings out both empathy and pro-social behavior. And then the other thing is adolescents who use power assertion in particular are poor models of self-control. to their kids. So kids see them as losing control, which is not a positive thing. Versus, the thing with love withdrawal and power assertion is that the kid's focusing on themselves. They hurt me. I'm sad because my parents have taken their love away. But induction focuses the kid's attention on other people, the consequences for others, not on the adolescent's shortcomings. So induction allows for the development of empathy. Okay, I'm going to link this. I'm going to put the link for this, and I would like you to watch this in the description for this video. There is a study, there have been a series of studies done at Ohio State in their developmental psychology department, which I actually am a product of that. I got my master's degree in developmental psychology before moving over to discipline. And a professor there named John Gibbs, who was my advisor, he advised my master's program, has been spending his entire career looking at inductive discipline and empathy and pro-social behavior. So there's just a very brief news clip, video clip talking about his work and interviewing him. So I would like you to take a look at that. Okay, before we move on to the next topic, one real quick interesting study that was just done a couple of years ago. Sometimes people will question, are people born with empathy or can you actually teach that? And I've just made the case that you can teach that through parenting skills, but there are some people who believe that it's hard to teach that. In 2018, there was a really interesting study using middle schoolers, and researchers gave them a video game specifically designed to teach empathy in kind of an underlying way. It was subtle. It wasn't, this is going to teach you empathy sort of thing, but it was a video game that involved learning how to be empathic toward characters. And they found that video game, kids who played that video game every day for 2 weeks, then they put them, and they contrasted them with a control group of kids who played a different video game. They put them all through the fMRI machines and then asked them questions. And they found that those who played that empathy game had greater reactivity in parts of the prefrontal cortex that are important for empathic responses. So executive functioning for cognitive empathy, being able to understand and read what another person is feeling. And then there were some other areas, insular cortex, the limbic system, which is emotional response. So the limbic system is always activated when you feel empathy for a person because there's a feeling of sadness or compassion. And then the temporal lobe, which has a lot to do with memory and can help you draw from memories of when you have seen that kind of situation before. So here's a little bit more evidence that there are things that we can do, including some of the things that teenagers love best, video games, to help teach empathy. We are going to turn now to the topic of religion. Talk a little bit about religion. How do adolescents' values change? How do religious values change, I should say, during adolescence? And I'm not going to spend much more than a couple of slides on this. There's a theory I want to tell you about, but I'm just trying to condense what we present here. So we know that religious institutions are designed by adults to introduce and indoctrinate certain beliefs to young people, and it ensures that those religious traditions will be carried on. So if your parents took you to church when you were younger, the point of that is that you will pick up those beliefs and carry those on and continue passing those on. So the question does this indoctrination work? And in many cases, it absolutely does. But when a religious change or a reawakening in adolescence occurs, it usually takes place during the adolescent period. Let me give you just a few statistics. We know that for many teenagers, religion is important. Surveys have found that 95% of teenagers believe in God or another higher being. So they have some sort of spiritual and religious belief in a higher being. 3/4 of teenagers report that they pray regularly, and then 1/2 report that they attend church services on some kind of regularity. So we know from the ages of 14 and between the ages of 14 and 20, I should say, these numbers do start to go down, and many teenagers begin to make a distinction between spiritual versus religious. So sometimes teenagers will say they're not religious, but they're spiritual, but so many of these adolescents report that there is a belief in something beyond themselves, and they transcribe to something beyond themselves. So that's really kind of the thing to think about. Religion doesn't necessarily equal spirituality, but many teenagers believe in I'm just keeping it real here. If my dogs come in and start growling and playing during the recording, then that's just the way it's going to be. I'm not going to re-record things. Okay, so as the point I just made, rise in spirituality versus religious. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about with religion has to do with how teenagers think, how their thinking changes in terms of religious understanding. And it runs very much tandem to Piaget's theory. So let me mention these couple of stages here. The first stage in deepening religious understanding occurs obviously in elementary school here, and he calls this the preoperational intuitive stage. So this is between 7 and 8. But at this point, kids' religious thoughts are fragmented. They don't necessarily understand the material in Bible stories or consider all the possible evidence. So in the Bible story about Moses looking at the face of God, if we were to ask kids, why was Moses afraid to look at God? Kids might say something like, he had a funny face. Because these are kids in the concrete operational period, right? So they can't think very well in terms of abstractions. They can think in terms of, oh, well, his face is funny, and that's why they behave that way. The second stage, the concrete operational stage, this one's actually called concrete operational religious thought stage, between 8 and 13 or so. So this is later in the concrete stage, the very beginnings of the formal operational stage. Kids focus on particular details of Bible stories. So when asked, why was Moses afraid to look at God? Kids might say something like, well, he was a ball of fire and they had to look away. Or because it was a bright light and they might have been blinded by it. So still a little bit of concrete imaging here you can see, but they're starting to understand the underlying concept, which is the power and the fear and the shame. And then finally, the formal operational stage, which certainly is into adolescence, about 14 and up. Kids have a greater understanding of more abstract, hypothetical statements. So when asked, why was Moses afraid to look at God? They say things like, God is holy and the world is sinful and Moses was part of that. Or something like, the awesomeness of God makes Moses feel shame. So it's a more abstract understanding in religion is how that ends. Okay, moving on to one final element here within moral development for adolescents. I just want to very quickly go over Kohlberg's moral development theory, primarily as it applies to adolescents. You've all heard of Kohlberg. I'm sure you study his theory in intro psych, but just to give you an idea, there's 35, close to 40 years of research looking at moral dilemmas. I mean, he dedicated his entire career to looking at moral development. It is certainly the most influential theory of moral development that we have. By using these moral dilemmas, he was mostly interested to see how people arrived at their answer. Not so much what their answer was, but how they reasoned and how they arrived at their answers. And he developed this theory, 3 levels of moral development with 2 stages within each. We're just going to talk about the 3 levels. But the important part of this is that movement through the levels is somewhat age-related, but not entirely. It's meant more through internalization. Movement through the stages is characterized by internalization. So this is a change from behavior that is externalized or externally controlled, like punishment, to behavior that is controlled by internal standards and principles. So when you're young, you choose to behave because you're afraid of being punished. That's externalized motivation. When you're older, hopefully, you choose to behave in an acceptable way because you know it's the right thing to do and you have those standards for yourself. That's an internalized standard or an internalized reason. So let's go through, and you all are familiar with the Heinz dilemma. Heinz was the guy in Europe and his wife was dying, and the pharmacy had a prescription and had medicine, and he didn't have any money. So should he let his wife die and not break the law, or should he break the law and save his wife? And that was and Kohlberg actually had a bunch of dilemmas like that. It just wasn't Heinz. So obviously we can't do the poll right now. Here are the levels, and I'm going to talk about these in the next couple of pages. You don't need to worry about knowing all of these stages. We're just going to talk about the levels. And these ages are rough, just rough estimates. So first we will talk here about the pre-conventional level. In the pre-conventional level, behavior is entirely externalized. People, kids, their morality is controlled by external reward and punishment entirely. So I mentioned that kids will behave because they don't want to be punished, and then also they will behave because they want some kind of reward. So if a kid shares with his friend, hoping that his friend will invite him over to his house, that would be considered pre-conventional level. Your behavior is entirely externalized. The second stage is called or second level is called the conventional level, and this involves intermediate internalization. So what this means is that some moral decisions and behaviors are based on internalization, others are not. And a couple ways to think about this is that kids respond and teens respond. There's somewhat of a what we call what Kohlberg called a good girl or good boy orientation. In other words, kids and teenagers value their relationships with others and they value the loyalty that they have to others. And so they behave largely because they want the approval of others. So that's still somewhat externalized. But also, they understand that rules and laws are for the common good. So they behave and they obey situations because they know those are the best things for everybody, which certainly represents more internalized. And then the last level is considered to be the post-conventional level, and this is completely internalized morality. So teens and tweens behave, adults behave from a personal moral code that's entirely internalized. So there's a recognition that laws and rules are important, but sometimes they need to be changed. We should avoid violating others' rights, but sometimes it's important to question the laws. And then in the last part of this post-conventional level, which is considered the highest level of moral thinking, people have their own independent moral code. So they obey social rules except where they contradict universal justice, and they follow their conscience above the law. So for example, the concept of euthanasia, and if that's segments where that is illegal, and in most places it is. If people decide that they're going to help a family member die because of mercy, then that would be reasoning at this highest level. If you break a promise to a friend because you have something, somebody else needs you more, that would be that sort of instance. So Kohlberg believed that the stages were fairly age-related, but not entirely. So let me give you some examples. He believed that kids and teens who engaged in delinquent behavior reasoned at level 1. So kids who are getting into trouble, oftentimes when they do behave correctly, it's to get something good or to avoid punishment. The average adolescent reasons at stage 2 at that conventional level, and most adolescents are situated right in the middle of this. So they're leaning more toward internalized morality, but also have some elements of externalized morality. Kohlberg found that a pretty sizable portion of Americans are reasoning at level 3, between 20 and 25%, with only like 5% at stage 6. So in his mind, at the highest levels of level 3, very few people are reasoning there. Most adults, he believes, are reasoning at level 2, at that kind of halfway between internalized and externalized morality. So the question you have here is, what tends to influence a person's position in Kohlberg's stages? One example would be exposure to more advanced models. So if kids if their parents are at a higher level than they are, then social learning essentially, and then discussion of value-laden issues. So it's important to talk to kids about these issues. Right now, we've got the coronavirus going on, and they're talking about having to ration things like respirators, especially for people who are cancer patients or who are older. That would be a really interesting moral issue to talk about with adolescents. What do you think about that? And why do you think? That's certainly a really contemporary, critical one that's happening right now. Now, even though Kohlberg still has, in many ways, the leading theory on moral development, he's certainly not without his criticisms. And the first one is that moral behavior doesn't always follow from moral thought. And it's kind of assumed in his theory that it does. So people may endorse high moral virtues while their behavior is immoral. So you could have kids who, are just outstanding citizens and good kids and, talk about just how important it is to make good decisions, and then they may cheat, for example. We see a fair amount of politicians and TV religious evangelists. They talk about all these things that are right and wrong, and then sometimes they're caught doing really unseemly things. So people will use rationalization and other defenses to free themselves from blame. So, for example, and these are Freudian defense mechanisms really, for people who talk about how important it is to obey rules in the government, but then they don't pay their fair share of taxes, they may have the rationalization, well, the government's just going to waste my money and use it on bad things anyway. So many times, if our moral behavior doesn't follow from our moral thinking, then we can come up with rationalizations for it. A more commonplace one you might see is, teenagers may believe it's important to give to people who are less fortunate than they are, to help out the needy. But yet, if they're walking through a big city and see a homeless person asking for money, they may walk right on by. So their behavior doesn't follow from their thought. And if you ask them why they did that, they may say things like, I'm sure they're just going to spend it on alcohol or drugs anyway. So I'm not going to further ingrain that behavior for them. And then a second problem with Kohlberg's theory is with his assessment techniques, very much with his assessment techniques. Critics say Kohlberg's dilemmas do not match those people face in their daily life. If you think about the Heinz dilemma, how many adolescents can even begin to get their mind around having to make that kind of decision? Most people can't. So adolescents face dilemmas regarding their friends, their family, schoolwork, relationships that they have, things of that nature. Okay, a third and final example of problems with his theory is that other cultures have values that are not strongly held in America or by Kohlberg's theory. The United States is very much an individualistic society. We know all that. And we value personal rights. We value individual rights, and we don't necessarily look for communal rights. And again, to go back to this pandemic that's happening right now, we're really seeing that. Other countries are, especially places like China, which is definitely less of an individualistic country. Those places, they obeyed the orders to go in, and I realize there are lots of human rights issues with China, and that notwithstanding. But a more collectivistic society, as we've talked about, people were willing to put the common good before themselves. In the United States, we don't see that as much. So we're seeing people really having problems with the stay-at-home order. They're still congregating because, in the U.S. we have the right to do lots of things. So these countries, like China, they don't emphasize individual rights and justice as certainly we do here.